Hello, this session, Reconceptualizing Literacy in Elementary Schools, is a free webinar offered by the Stark County Educational Service Center Curriculum Department. My name is Amanda Nickerson, and I am the K-12 Literacy Consultant at the Stark County Educational Service Center. I'll be a presenter for this session today, and I am so excited to be able to virtually deliver professional development to help support you, your students, and Ohio's plan to raise literacy achievement. I want to open up this session by sharing a quote from an EdWeek article that said, educators urgently need a national movement for professional learning about reading. We should declare a no-shame zone for this work to make it safe for all educators to say, I have unfinished learning around literacy. I wholeheartedly believe that creating a no-shame zone is imperative. No matter where you are in your learning, I'm asking this one thing. Please keep an open mind and be open to re-examining current literacy practices. We are all in this together. The time has come to reconceptualize literacy. So please take a moment to read this comic. Does this ring a bell? What this tragic attempt at humor illustrates is something that plays out in our classrooms daily, and not just in kindergarten. This comic illustrates phonological deficits, but it's no laughing matter because it's representative of real life for many of our disfluent students. David Kilpatrick reminds us that for good readers, reading is fluent. Fluent means fast and accurate and includes proper expression. Fluent readers comprehend more of what they read because they can focus their attention on the meaning, not just figuring out words. So what is the impact of all of this for students like our fictional friend in the comic? Well, some of our students resort to compensating. As David Kilpatrick expresses in his book, Equipped for Reading Success, we are not helping these children by letting them function that way. With each passing year, the vocabulary load increases, so comprehension becomes more challenging. When word recognition is difficult, all school subjects suffer, and so does the student's motivation. Reading comprehension is our goal, and in the most direct route to good reading comprehension is to make the word recognition process automatic so that a student can focus all of his or her mental energy on the meaning. The fact is, some of our students don't understand the words, don't understand the sentences, can't build a text base, can't build a mental model, and don't have the skills for academic conversations. And we are all responsible for filling in the gaps. We know that there are myriad causes of reading difficulties, even in older struggling readers, including a learning disability such as a language disorder, dyslexia, processing speed or fluency disorders, generally low learning ability that manifests across all subject areas. Sometimes we see language, experiential, or vocabulary deficits on school entry. Poor attendance is a factor, inconsistency in schooling, limited English proficiency, and sometimes even insufficiently powerful instruction within our own classrooms. Some of the aforementioned causes are biological or pathological but treatable, and others may be ameliorated or eliminated by making thoughtful, intentional changes to our instruction. We simply cannot afford to close our eyes to the glaring need. According to the 2017 NAEP, the overall achievement level results in reading leave something to be desired. Only 37% of fourth graders scored proficient or advanced on the assessment. 31% scored in the basic range and 32% scored in the below basic range. But there's great news. Compelling evidence from a convergence of current reading research indicates that between 90 and 95% of all students can achieve literacy skills at or approaching grade level. So we can change the data and we can change students' futures. And this is where Ohio's plan to raise literacy achievement comes in. This flexible guide is designed to be a working document to meet state, regional, and local needs for supporting language and literacy development. I encourage all teachers to read through Ohio's plan because literacy as used here is not synonymous with English language arts. Literacy is bigger than ELA. It's an umbrella term, and it encompasses all of the content areas from birth through 12th grade. So this is a document that is intended to guide all of us. Allow me to explain. In 2000, the National Reading Panel identified 5 essential components of reading instruction. This model, adapted by the Michigan Department of Education and adopted by the Ohio Department of Education, shows how this emphasis shifts as we move into the intermediate grades and beyond. For example, phonemic awareness and phonics are 2 crucial components in grades K through 3, and word study, specifically morphology and syllabication, remains an important component for adolescents that builds upon that foundation that's built in K3 with phonemic awareness and phonics. So in relation to architecture, we think about it this way. A cornerstone is traditionally the first stone that's laid for a structure, with all other stones laid in reference. A cornerstone marks the geographical location by orienting a building in a specific direction. So phonemic awareness is essentially the cornerstone of our instruction. It is something that will orient us in a specific direction, and today we are going to examine it very closely. Now, I've been in education long enough to have witnessed the metaphorical pendulum swing a few times, and it's important to note that the science of reading is not another pendulum swing. This is not about overemphasizing word recognition skills. Although I should say this should not be about overemphasizing word recognition skills, because there are some that will advocate for that, but this is not what it's about. This is not about spending an inordinate amount of time on phonemic awareness, phonics, and word study. However, we cannot continue to overemphasize comprehension at the exclusion of everything else. And this is exactly what we have done historically speaking. We have to address the elephant in the metaphorical room. And that is that problems with underlying linguistic structures may be obscured, and they often are. We interpret nearly everything as a comprehension problem. So we often say things like, Billy can't comprehend the text. We do this because we perceive weak comprehension skills, and they really do exist. This is not a figment of our imagination. They do surface on our state tests and our other assessments. We see them day after day. And so we give Billy more of the same. We ask him to find the main idea and details, to make predictions, to make inferences, to summarize, to compare and contrast, and we attempt to pinpoint the need to target the perceived gaps, but we largely target comprehension, especially in the intermediate grades and beyond, but often the same thing can be said about early elementary. But what if? What if Billy is struggling to comprehend because he doesn't match letters to the sounds they represent? He doesn't know how to decode unknown words. He doesn't have automaticity. He can't read fluently, and or maybe his vocabulary is limited. What may look like a comprehension problem on the surface may actually be a symptom of an underlying deficit. And we have to really grapple with this idea and come face to face with it. This idea that meaning-focused instruction won't remediate a word-level deficit. So how do we recognize a decoding problem if one exists? Well, here are some red flags. Students who struggle with decoding might guess from context. They might avoid sounding out new words or confuse similar sounds, symbols, or words. They might inaccurately read nonsense words or words when they're presented out of context. They might be slow to develop sight word habits, which means that on the surface, it looks like their vocabulary is pretty small. They may tire easily or look away or become frustrated. They might express that they hate to read. And additionally, we may notice that their listening comprehension is better than their reading comprehension. When they're not responsible for lifting the print off of the text, they'll likely engage in really thoughtful discussions, but then when asked to read and discuss a text, they may disengage or withdraw. Those are some red flags that can really signal that there might be an underlying problem with decoding. This is a simplified diagram that shows the hierarchy of reading and how we should respond. And it shows that teaching phonology and phonics improves accuracy, and accuracy is the most pressing concern. It is the most primary concern, the beginning concern, the most foundational concern. It provides a foundation for more sophisticated tasks. And once students can read accurately, then our next goal is to work to improve their fluency and automaticity, because automaticity frees working memory to focus on comprehension. If students continue to read inaccurately and laboriously, comprehension will be impeded in literally every content area. So unfortunately, we've been putting the carts before the horse. So let's unpack this a bit. Does accuracy matter? The answer is an emphatic yes. If students don't have strong phonological awareness and decoding skills, they make errors. So they may guess based on the first letter, but there's a huge difference between first and final, 50 and 15, and ostrich and owl. So kids may guess the first common word or the most common word, like house instead of home. And in a case like this, even though the meaning is similar, the connotation is impacted. So when they guess, even in situations like this, it impacts comprehension. Accuracy matters. If you are trying to teach sophisticated concepts within your discipline, precision matters. Consider this. The most unimportant word in the English language, matters for comprehension. We have to teach our students accuracy. There's a big difference between my mom got cold and my mom got a cold. And yet, this is something that we often shirk within our lessons. We have to remember that accuracy paves the way for fluency. To read a text, one has to read the words independently. Some students may still need some instruction in phonological awareness and/or phonics. Many know basic sounds and spelling patterns, but their oral reading fluency suffers, and we can address accuracy through word study. And this is something that has a place in every classroom, in every school, though it will be nuanced. The problem is we make a lot of assumptions, such as believing that we are teaching kids how to read in the primary grades, and that by the intermediate and secondary grades, all of our kids are magically reading to learn, when the truth is some of them still can't read accurately or fluently. And some of them still need to learn how to read. And I've said this already, but I think the same is true in early elementary. Sometimes we make the assumption that our kids are further along skill-wise than they are, when really they're still learning those building blocks. They're still learning how to read at the word level, and we're pushing them to read at the sentence level or the paragraph level, because we know that meaning is the goal, but we're rushing to get there. So we have to challenge our assumptions. As Anita Archer likes to say, when our assumptions lead to dire consequences, we commit suicide. Let's examine one of the ways we're all probably guilty of a suicide. And that is that we tend to emphasize what is tested. This means we focus a lot on vocabulary, comprehension, and writing in response to text. And this trickles down again into K2 before testing ever is even something that your kids are experiencing. Unfortunately, we have students who have cracks in their foundations. They have underdeveloped word recognition skills. They may have phonological deficits. They may have weak phonic decoding skills, and they may lack automaticity. They may be disfluent. And those missing steps have huge ramifications. It impacts how much working memory is available to attend to vocabulary, comprehension, and writing. And it creates a major obstacle for our students to try to scale. Vocabulary knowledge, for example, really must be intentionally nurtured to ensure that students are reading and that they're ready for the greater vocabulary demands of reading complex texts and writing multi-paragraph essays. We know that this is where our students need to be eventually, but we need to pay attention to the cracks in the foundation, or all of this falls apart. And we find ourselves in a situation where we're asking students to scale this wall or to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and that's really not fair to them. So to ensure that our students are equipped to pass the test and ultimately to fully participate in our society as adults, we need to be intentional about how we are addressing the 5 components of reading and writing in our classrooms. We need to intentionally focus on building a strong foundation and fill in the gaps to enable our students to have solid footing on the stairway to success. In his book, Essentials of Assessing, Preventing, and Overcoming Reading Difficulties, Dr. David Kilpatrick asserts that every point in a child's development of word-level reading is substantially affected by phonological awareness skills, from learning letter names all the way up to efficiently adding new multisyllabic words to their automatic word vocabulary. These word-level skills also have implications for comprehension and writing, as we saw on the previous slides. If, for example, a student struggles with reading multisyllabic words, even by 4th grade, they will have a difficult time navigating text on the Ohio State test. As you see on the slide, I blacked out every word that was multisyllabic. So if you had a student with a profound deficit in that area, they would have a really hard time making sense out of this passage. And they would also struggle with understanding reading prompts and answer choices. So again, sometimes what looks like a comprehension problem, sometimes what's reported as a comprehension problem is actually caused by an underlying subskill. So we may see on a state test result in 3rd grade that a student is struggling with informational text, but it's possible that something else is contributing to that comprehension problem. So I want to reiterate that this is not a pendulum swing. This is a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift describes a fundamental change in an approach or an underlying assumption that governs the behavior of an individual, group, organization, or society. So to elaborate and teach them all to read, catching kids before they fall through the cracks, Elaine McEwen identifies several paradigms that impact reading achievement. We used to think that demographics were a big determinant of students' academic destiny, but now we focus less on deficits and more on providing opportunities to learn. We used to wait and see as a solution for struggling readers, hoping that they would catch up, but now we know that we must prioritize prevention and intervention. We used to believe that reading is natural, and now we know that speaking is natural, reading is rocket science, and that we literally rewire the neural pathways in the brain when we learn to read. We used to believe that the best way to teach reading was through whole group instruction, but now we know that although explicit instruction at the whole group is important, instruction must also be differentiated. We used to believe that teachers should have complete autonomy over instructional materials and methods, but now we know that teachers must make decisions based on scientifically based reading research, not their own preferences and teaching philosophies. We used to think that there were many inalterable variables that contributed to student failure, but now we know that the brain is malleable, and we focus instead on alterable variables by promoting a growth mindset. We also discard competitive school cultures in favor of a more collaborative, team-oriented culture. When we know better, we do better. And this point is worth reiterating. Reading is among the highest expressions of human intelligence, and it is critical to our ability to thrive within our society. Teaching children to read proficiently is a fundamental moral obligation. As Louisa Most has famously said, teaching reading is rocket science. And although teaching reading is rocket science, we can look at a simplified model to conceptualize the multifaceted integrated reading processes. The simple view of reading illustrates that reading comprehension is the product of word recognition, decoding, or the ability to read words on a page, and language comprehension, which is understanding those words. Excuse me. In order to read competently and proficiently, students need to have strengths in both domains. And the simple view of reading is expanded upon through Scarborough's reading rope. And this theoretical model, which many of you may be familiar with by now, shows that word recognition skills are our primary concerns, and they should become increasingly automatic. Language comprehension skills are our secondary concerns, and they should become increasingly more strategic. So over time, these overlapping skills lead to strong reading comprehension. But, and this is a big but, if an individual thread is missing or tattered, the whole rope is weaker as a result, and reading comprehension may be impeded. We see this across disciplines, not just in language arts. The word recognition skills remain the same across disciplines. So students have to have sufficient phonological awareness, decoding skills, and sight word vocabularies to read the words, period. Doesn't matter if it's math, science, social studies, or language arts, they have to be able to access those words. And then the top of the row looks different depending on the subject area. So we see that across content areas, the rows are structurally similar, yet diverse and nuanced. But the constant are those word recognition skills. They are important no matter what. The simple view of reading also helps us contextualize the 4 reading profiles of students in our schools. So we have skilled readers who have good language comprehension and good word recognition. We have students in our classrooms with specific reading comprehension difficulties who have poor language comprehension and skilled word recognition. They are students who truly need targeted intervention on the language comprehension side of the simple view of reading. So they might truly have some comprehension deficits. Students with specific word recognition difficulties have good language comprehension, but they have poor word recognition. And students with mixed reading difficulties have poor language comprehension and poor word recognition. So the 2 profiles on the left side of the chart require explicit systematic multisensory phonemic awareness and phonics instruction. But all kids really can benefit from it, and that's a positive thing. So again, with respect to key intervention needs, this chart really shows that students with specific word recognition difficulties need systematic phonemic awareness and phonics instruction. And students with mixed reading difficulties require explicit instruction in word recognition skills such as phonemic awareness and phonics as well, but they also need that coupled with explicit instruction in some comprehension level activities. Walpole and McKenna's Stairway to Proficiency shows generally how students progress towards skilled reading. It kind of looks like the staircase that I showed just a few moments ago. It shows that students must develop basic alphabet knowledge. They have to be able to use letter sounds and learn letter patterns and then apply that knowledge. And that they should be taught basic phonics skills such as blends and digraphs, R-controlled vowels, vowel, consonant E, and vowel teams to increase word recognition and fluency at the word level and phrase level and sentence level. And then they must develop skills that enable them to decode multi-syllable words, those advanced phonics skills and morphology knowledge as they continue to refine their fluency and comprehension skills and read lengthier, more complex texts. And really beyond that, at the summit, if you want to think of it that way, we really want to be able to help kids to focus on building their vocabulary and comprehension. We know that vocabulary and comprehension are unconstrained skills, which means that we continue to learn them over our entire lifetimes, even into our, golden years. So students will continue to expand and deepen their understanding of reading and the wider world through explicit instruction and wide reading of various texts across various genres, across content areas as well. And that's really the goal. This is important because throughout students' formal schooling, they're taught increasingly specialized and sophisticated, but less generalizable literacy skills and routines. So in the earliest years, in elementary, we focus on basic literacy skills. We should be focusing on building foundational skills such as decoding and print and literacy conventions, recognizing high frequency words, basic punctuation, sentence level writing, and so forth. And then at the intermediate literacy stage, so some elementary teachers listening to this, you're at that stage, 3rd grade, 4th grade, where students are developing more sophisticated skills and they're beginning to decode more multisyllabic words. They're improving their reading fluency. You're working on expanding vocabulary and giving them more exposure to advanced texts, among other things. Maybe even working backwards to kind of backfill some of those basic literacy skills for kids who require that. At the apex of this pyramid of complexity, though, is disciplinary literacy, and it is the content-specific literacy skills that are required in particular disciplines, But note that it's built upon intermediate and basic literacy skills. It's not completely independent from those underlying skills. It is in some ways dependent upon them to support the meaning making that we strive for within our disciplines. And this is another way of investigating the increasing specialization of literacy. The peaks of each pyramid here reveal a changing emphasis across the grade level continuum. So in the early grades, we see that basic literacy is prioritized and emphasized. In the intermediate grades, of course, like we just explored, intermediate literacy is prioritized. And by high school, disciplinary literacy is really king. But I want you to note that the pyramids overlap, and depending on students' strengths and weaknesses, they may be at a different place on the continuum. But this graphic illustrates the ultimate goal, okay? And now we're going to dig a little deeper. And this means that we teach disciplinary literacy skills beginning in elementary school, but we prioritize basic literacy skill development. It also means that even when we're emphasizing intermediate literacy or disciplinary literacy skills, we may need to provide scaffolds or interventions for underlying skills so that our students can be successful within our disciplines. Now, research reveals very emphatically, very clearly, that poor readers' problems often begin with phonology. The language skills that most reliably distinguish groups of good and poor readers are specific to the phonological or speech sound processing system. And these problems persist even into adulthood without intervention, particularly for students with dyslexia. Phonological problems may impact students' awareness of consonants, vowels, onsets, rhymes, syllables, grammatical endings, meaningful parts, and the spelling units that represent them, and then ultimately that can impede meaning. Students have to learn the alphabetic principle. We don't write words unlike languages like Chinese. We write sequences of characters designed to represent sequences of phonemes in spoken words. And alphabetic writing involves phoneme-based characters. Thus, phoneme skills are needed for both sounding out new words and for remembering the words that we read. So consider this. What do you see? You see the word cat, right? This seems pretty straightforward, but think for a moment. When you saw the word cat, what did you hear in your mind's ear? You likely heard the word cat, which is made up of 3 phonemes, k, at, cat. And once you decoded the word and heard it in your mind's ear, what did you see in your mind's eye? Perhaps you saw something like this. Perhaps it wasn't clip art, perhaps it was, a realistic looking cat, but probably this brought to mind a small domestic feline. So what does this mean? Well, DeHaan, an illustrious cognitive neuroscientist, asserts that fluent readers are hearing the text in their brain, and Erie's work shows us that they make sound symbol correspondences. Another researcher, Myers, reminds us that reading is an analytical process that's so fast that it appears that we're reading whole words when in fact we are converting the letters on the page into sounds. And then the brain recognizes those groups of sounds as words, which is pretty magical. Mark Seidenberg's eternal triangle, which is on this slide, illustrates the connections made in our brain whenever we read a word like cat. As demonstrated on the preceding slides, often skilled readers access the text through the orthography, the letters. And then we activate the phonology, the part of our brain that processes sounds activates, and we hear the word in our mind's ear, just like our little illustration. And this allows us to connect to the semantics, the meaning. Now, it is possible to circumvent the phonology. It's possible to read by just accessing the orthography, the letters, and then accessing the semantics by a secondary route. And we see that on the left-hand side where we go from the orthography straight up to the semantics with that solid arrow. But research has demonstrated that this is less efficient, and less effective. It is a compensatory strategy that many unskilled readers employ. So simply put, we do not want our students to compensate. We want them to read skillfully, and skilled readers use the print, the orthography, the sounds, the phonology, in tandem to access the semantics, to access the meaning of the text that we're reading. And that's where all of that integration and intertwining of those different strands come to bear upon these processes. So students learn to read from speech to print. Due to recent scientific advancements, we know this with certainty. We know that students learn to read from speech to print. It's no longer speculation. A child who has gained a basic understanding of the relationships between print and sound can get on with the task of learning to read words. And we know that comprehension is the ultimate goal. It involves all kinds of other logic, most notably spoken language and background knowledge, but everything is contingent on recognizing and comprehending sequences of words accurately and efficiently. So put simply, we can explicitly teach students that phoneme grapheme correspondences undergird our language, and we can show them how this works. This works with phonetically regular words. It works with words like fake that have silent letters. It works with words like sun, in which a grapheme, a letter, or a combination of letters makes an unexpected sound. We can do this with every word in our language, and our brain does this quite efficiently, but explicit instruction is necessary. This is supported by empirical research. Erie concludes that readers who read by sight form connections between letters and spellings and sounds and pronunciations in the words. And she elaborates in later studies that these connections are formed out of the reader's knowledge of the alphabetic system. This includes knowledge of sound symbol correspondence, phonemic awareness, and an understanding of spelling patterns that reoccur in different words. We have learned a lot about the reading brain in recent decades, thanks to modern science, and we have a useful illustration of this because of contributions from Dr. Stanislas Dehaene. Simply put, in most people, the left cerebral hemisphere subsumes most language functions. So the left side of our brain is basically where all of our language processes happen. The phonological processing system is responsible for pronunciation and articulation. This happens in Broca's area, for those of you who are familiar with brain anatomy. And this phonological processing system also kind of attends to phoneme analysis and phoneme grapheme association in the angular gyrus. This system is represented by orange ovals in this diagram. The orthographic processing system is located in the occipital lobe, and it is the visual word form area. It's commonly called the brain's letterbox. This area is blue, and the temporal lobe, particularly Wernicke's area, is responsible for language comprehension, linking spoken words with the meaning. Because reading is an unnatural human innovation, we actually forge pathways that link the back and middle areas, and a vast system of white matter pathways develop as we learn how to read. We actually build brain architecture, and our brain is forever changed. And this really enables us to translate print into speech with accuracy, fluency, and comprehension as a result, and to translate, speech into print conversely. This complex process is in some ways simplified by Marilyn Adams' four-part processing model. It shows that when we read, the orthographic and phonological processors activate and interact to support word recognition. Once a word is decoded and recognized, the meaning processor activates, which helps the student access the vocabulary within the text, and then the context processor is activated, which helps us to process concepts and information, sentence-level context, and text structure. So this is a simplification of all the places that are lighting up in our brain as we're learning to read and the roles that they fulfill. All of this goes to show that phonology plays an important role in learning to read and within that four-part processing system. So if a spoken word is heard and retained in phonological memory, it can be recognized more easily in print. Kids are going to have an easier time reading that word. If the meaning of a word is known and it has been seen in print, it's easier to play with its phonemes. We can generalize patterns and learn to apply it to other words as well. If the sounds and syllables in a word have been analyzed, its meaning can be more easily stored in the semantic lexicon or our mental dictionary. And if those sounds in spoken words can be analyzed and manipulated, research has indicated that the words will be easier to remember for reading and spelling. So essentially, when all four parts are working together fluently, this catapults our students toward the fluent processing of text. But when we pull out phonological awareness, the whole structure falls apart. And this is what we see sometimes with some of our students who are struggling. They are missing this crucial piece that holds so many other elements aloft. So some listeners may be asking, what exactly is phonological awareness? Not familiar with this term. Well, phonological awareness is a broad skill that includes identifying and manipulating units of oral language, so words, syllables, onset, and rhyme. And children who have phonological awareness are able to identify and make oral rhymes. They can clap out the number of syllables in a word. They might be able to recognize words with the same initial sounds. Phonemic awareness is not a synonym, it's not interchangeable, but it is a related term. Phonemic awareness is a subset of phonological awareness that focuses specifically on recognizing and manipulating phonemes, the smallest units of sound. Phonemes are what we combine to form syllables in words. Tolman's hourglass figure can help us understand how phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, and morphological awareness skills build over time. In the preschool years, many students are engaged in phonological awareness tasks, like how to identify sentences or words or syllables, to recognize rhyme. And then they might learn how to segment, blend, and stretch phonemes. Eventually, we want our students to learn to delete, substitute, and reverse phonemes. And while all of these tasks can be done orally with gestures or tokens, or in the dark, as lots of people like to say, it is important to acknowledge that research does suggest that phonemic awareness training is more effective when children are taught to use letters to manipulate phonemes. So even if you are using those tokens or you are using gestures, we do want to bring the letters in as soon as possible so that our students are mapping the speech to print. That's really where the magic happens. And when students begin to map speech to print or phonemes to graphemes, this is really when phonics instruction formally begins. They progress through a particular scope and sequence from basic phonics to advanced phonics. Early on, students are introduced to some morphemes, particularly inflectional endings like ed or ing. But once the 6 syllable types are mastered, morphology becomes a much bigger priority. We see this happen in 3rd grade and onward. And this is when word study begins to emphasize roots and affixes, as well as some etymology, some word origins when it is relevant. So we have to teach students the relationships between phonemes, graphemes, and letters. This is really important. This is what enables word recognition, and it is the first step towards skilled reading. So it's helpful to really define then what we mean by word recognition if this is what we're striving for. Word recognition is the ability to recognize whole words, and it's dependent on the ability to recognize the units from which a word is built. The layers from the bottom up represent a rough sequence of development in word recognition ability. The layers viewed from the top down represent what a good reader already knows about a familiar printed word. We begin teaching letters and sounds in kindergarten, and we work our way up the chart. And by the time students are adolescents, we presume that they have a large sight word vocabulary, many words that they can retrieve and read immediately by sight. But if they don't, in 3rd and 4th grade, we need to start working backwards to assess their knowledge of morphemes and syllables. And maybe even further back than that, are they missing some basic phonics skills? Do we have some phonological deficits that we're going to need to remediate? This can be a really helpful tool for conceptualizing prevention and remediation of those word recognition skills. And this shows it kind of in a different form. It's by Marcia Henry. She just shows how we progress from learning phonological awareness to the alphabet and letter and sounds. I would argue that we want to be focusing on the letters and sounds in kindergarten as well. While we might focus on rhyming and some of those sub-skills, those larger skills in kindergarten, we really do want our students to be engaging with letters and sounds and working towards reading CVC words in kindergarten with a heavier emphasis. And then we can see here how we progress to Anglo-Saxon consonants and vowels, compound words and things like that, prefixes and suffixes, those 6-syllable types, onto Latin roots and Greek combining forms in those upper grades. And again, this is just a chart that shows you kind of a progression here from early phonological awareness to basic phoneme awareness onto advanced phonemic awareness. And you can see that in early phonological awareness, we're helping kids to learn letter names and phonemes as they're working with some of these larger units. By the time we have students focusing on blending and segmenting, we want to help them really refine and build upon their decoding skills to sound out unfamiliar words, to really drill into our phonics instruction. And then as we continue on to look at some of those advanced skills like deletion, substitution, and reversal, we want to help our students begin to build upon that orthographic mapping and expand their sight word vocabulary so that they are instantly recognizing more and more words by sight. This shows the changing emphasis of subskills of these 5 components of reading. And again, you can see in K and halfway through 1st grade, we're really focused on getting kids to blend and segment those phonemes and words, at, cat, right? And beyond that, middle of 1st grade, we start to move on towards some more advanced skills. We have a basic decision framework here. It basically just shows that if we're giving Ames Web or Acadians or Dibbles or something like that 3 times a year to monitor student performance, for those kids that are scoring below benchmark, we need to look a little bit under the hood. We need to determine if there is a decoding or phonological awareness deficit. And so we might give some diagnostics, which is beyond the scope of the time that we have today. But we need to be able to determine ultimately, is there a problem? Where exactly is it? What skills are missing? We might give the Hegarty phonemic awareness screener or diagnostics, excuse me, or the PAST. We might give a phonics inventory, such as the one by core, which is excellent. And that's really going to help us to figure out precisely what that next step is for our students. Regardless of the subject that you happen to teach, regardless of the grade level that you happen to teach, this really gets at that idea that within a multi-tiered system of supports, the goal is prevention. The goal is to build a strong foundation by explicitly teaching foundational skills to mastery and catching those gaps when they are newly becoming apparent, right? Not just waiting for this sinkhole to expand, but to kind of patch it and keep an eye on it from the beginning. So according to Dr. David Kilpatrick, we do have to face the reality that in students with a phonological core deficit, phonological awareness does not naturally develop through exposure to literacy activities. Even explicit and systematic phonics instruction or morphology and word study, thus phonological awareness must be directly trained in these students. This will look different in every grade level and content area, will look different in core instruction than it will in tier 2 or 3 interventions, but we all have a part to play, and we really want our students to be climbing up this step, especially with an emphasis on blending, segmenting, deletion, addition, and substitution. Those are really where we get the most bang for our buck, with letters integrated as often as we can when students are able to do the task. General principles for teaching phonological awareness then really follow a progression of phonological skill development. They focus on students' attention on speech sounds before focusing on letters. So we see this with Hegarty, we see this with Kilpatrick. To be honest, there's some contention about this. There's some research that's being examined a little bit more closely at the present. If you're doing it this way without putting the letters in front of you, I suggest this is kept at a minimum, right? That we're using this as a phonics warm-up, that we might be doing this whole class, but then we're also giving our students an opportunity to get those letters in front of us, to get them in front of them for more intentional practice. And if you have questions about this, I suggest reading the National Reading Panel. It is very emphatic that embedding those letters into our phonemic awareness practices really led to the greatest results overall. We also want to encourage mouth awareness and use mirrors. We want to include all 44 English phonemes in instruction. We want, again, to use letters to represent and support phonemic awareness. So if we're using tokens to segment at, the next time we want to add letters, C-A-T, at, right? I'm going to show you a couple examples of what this might look like, but we want to make sure that letters are a part of our phonemic awareness instruction as well. We also want to make it multisensory and involve students' hands, eyes, bodies, and mouths whenever possible. We want to keep it brief. About 5 to 10 minutes a day for 12 to 20 weeks are really all that most young students need to improve speech awareness or phonological awareness. So we don't want to overdo it. We don't want to lose instructional time that we need for other things. We just need a little bit of time for this. But we do want to be explicit. We need to do the gradual release of responsibility with the I do it, we do it, you do it, gradual release. And we want to give our students immediate corrective feedback. When you get a moment, I highly recommend checking out this video if you're someone who's not sure about how you say each sound. We do want to be careful that we do not produce sounds with the schwa sound attached. So I don't want to say ta, I want to say t. I don't say duh, I say d. We want to clip those sounds. And if you're someone who recognizes, oh my goodness, I guess I do add a schwa sound, then I would suggest taking a look at this video and just practicing along with the educator on the film. We also want to be aware of the fact that blending phonemes has a little bit of a skill progression here. Typically around age 6, we can see kids who can blend 2 to 3 phonemes, typically not blends, although if students are ready for that, we want to provide enrichment opportunities for students who are capable. Around age 6.5, we typically see students who can blend 3 to 4 phonemes, including blends. More simply, we want to pay attention to the fact that some sounds can be extended. These are called continuants. So I can say or and hold and extend those sounds. That makes it a little bit easier to blend phonemes, especially if that's the first sound in a word, compared to a stop like b, k, d, g, j, where I would have to bounce it. I would have to say b, b, bat, right? B, b, bat. So that's something to kind of consider, that a word like ass, if the kids are working on blends, it's a little bit easier than another word that would contain a lot of stops. And then tricky words, tricky phonemes would be X and Q, the X and Qu sounds, because it's actually kind of an amalgamation of 2 phonemes, K, S, X, together. And Q says Qu, W, Qu. So it kind of gives you a rough level of complexity to consider as you're teaching the order of blending and segmenting. We also might consider different levels of scaffolding as we are teaching phonemic awareness levels. So this is David Kilpatrick's recommendations. Again, he kind of recommends just using letter sound cues initially to give kids an idea of how the prompt works if needed, and then to remove the letters and just use manipulatives, move on to clapping or tapping, then verbally emphasizing certain parts, saying it louder or softer. and then just getting to the point where you're orally manipulating the sounds. But again, we know that that those letters can be really helpful for phonemic awareness. So that's something to consider. It's something to keep researching. It's something that I will keep researching and disseminating to our districts as there's further information provided. The main thing is we need to be teaching the kids how to manipulate these sounds and to use it to read new novel words. I have created a phonological awareness support drive, so you can access materials using the tiny URL on this slide. It is under construction. I'm constantly adding materials here, but I invite you to check it out. I also invite you to check out the UFly Virtual Teaching Resource Hub. There's really great resources here for teaching remotely in particular, or using the tools on your smartboard if you are in a classroom setting, in a brick and mortar setting. And I also have some tools that I created last March while we were shut down that may be used for phonological awareness as well. One of these is Say It, Move It. And so here's basically how it works. You as a teacher would say something like, say no. The student would say no. You would say, move it, oh. The student says, oh. You say word, they say no, and they reset it. So again, the teacher would say no. The student would say no. I would say move it, oh. They would move it. I would say what word? They would say no, and we would reset it. The same thing can really be done with sound boxes or Elkonin boxes. I have templates in the folder for this as well. So I might say yes. The students would say yes. I say move it. They move a token, yes. And then the student says yes. The teacher says word, and the student says yes, and then we reset. So again, say yes, yes, move it, yes. The student would go yes. The teacher would say what word? The student would say yes, and you would reset it. We can do a similar activity with onset and rhyme or syllables. So I could do the same thing with elephant. Say elephant, the student would say elephant. I would say move it, elephant. The student would say elephant. I would ask word, and they would say elephant, and we would reset. So elephant is basically how we would segment that, working through that process on the previous slide. For onset and rhymes segmentation, we can do the same thing. I really like to use like Legos or Unifix cubes for this because they're larger chunks, and you can actually attach like a red and a yellow for the rhyme part and use a green one for the onset. So you might say cat. The student would say cat. You would say move it. They say cat. After you model, you ask word. They say cat, and they reset. So again, I would say cat. The student would say cat. I would say move it. At. The student would say at. I would say what word? They would say cat. They might even put the blocks together as they blend it, and then they would reset. I also want to introduce you to phoneme grapheme mapping. Basically, you need a grid. It can look anything like this. You can kind of modify it as you'll see on the following slide, but the main idea is that you want students to isolate individual phonemes, and then you want them to write the orthography. So I might do something like this. T, r, a, sh. And then I might have the student either write with a dry erase marker or use magnetic letters or tiles to add the orthography right underneath. T, r, a, sh. Now notice that TR is a blend, but I have them in different boxes because they both retain their individual sounds. They're just blended together. And SH is a digraph that makes a distinct sound, sh. So the two letters are put in a box together. So after the kids would push the tokens, r, a, sh, and add the letters, t, r, a, sh. Then they would blend it, trash, and we would reset and do another word. We can do the same thing with any template. Really, this is just another way that I have conceptualized phoneme graphing mapping. You might use this on a board. It's one of the templates that's in my file. So I have a green, a yellow, and a red box to show the beginning, middle, and ending sounds, and I put a picture in a box. So they're going to segment the sounds in dog, and then they are going to add the letters that represent those sounds in dog. You may print something like this and use fingers to pinch and laminate it and let kids write with a dry erase marker. You might use clothespins with letters on it where they clip it after tapping it, or you might just have students tap with their fingers, d-og, while you project this, and then have a student come up and add a letter like this, d-og. What word? Dog. You can do the same thing with words containing digraphs, where I can say, let's tap out the sounds, sh, e, p. Let's add the letters, sh, e. And again, you can see that multiple letters are sometimes in the same box. We're not separating them. We want to show when two letters make one distinct sound, and we want to make that very transparent to our students. Here we have sled, s, l, e, d. We add the letters, l, e, d. S-L-E-D is there. Again, S-L is a blend. They get separate boxes. And then we have trophy, t, r, o, e. And again, as different patterns are introduced, as we introduce other sounds that letters make, like the fact that Y sometimes says E at the end of a word, phoneme graphing mapping can really help make this transparent for students. Also really like applying this to sight word instruction or high frequency word instruction. And what we know is that some of these Dolch and Fry words really are fully decodable. And I love what the folks at Readsters have done with this. Linda Farrell and Michael Hunter call these flash words, which is why there's a little flash up in the corner. These are words that I know how they work. I've been taught phonics. I know the common sounds of each letter. And so I can just use that to spell these high frequency words. I don't need to memorize them. I don't need flashcards flashed in front of me. I can use what I know about decoding to spell them. And so for a word, I might just kind of segment the sounds. And I apologize. I'm trying to remember which word I used. Oh, had. Okay, sorry about that. So for had, I would do add. And then I would add the orthography. Add. H-A-D. I'm going to rewrite it down there, and I have the word had. Again, each of those sounds makes the expected sound. Each letter does what we would expect it to. So if it's a flash word, I can just use my great phonics knowledge to sound it out and write it. I can do the same thing with some words that are a little bit more irregular. I don't need to flash flashcards and try to memorize these words as whole units either. I can be kind of analytical about how I'm approaching it. So for a word like said, I might segment ed, okay? And I might ask my students, what letter would you expect to make the first sound? And they might go S, right? So I'd say, great job. S is right. Yes, S usually says. What would you expect the last letter to be? Said. And they might say D, right? And you say, great, you're right. D is correct. That would be what we would expect it to say. D says D, okay? And then you might ask them, so in said, what does it sound like the middle sound would be represented by? Or what would middle letter be? Said. And probably a lot of kids are going to say E, right? Because E says eh, they know that. At the time that said is taught, we typically haven't taught that AI says A. So we don't even need to go there. We can just show them, actually, yes, you're right. E usually says eh, and we would expect that. But in the word said, there's a part that we have to memorize. There's a part that we have to know by heart. We actually spell said, S-A-I-D, AI says eh in the word said. And so you might put a heart above it, and we refer to this as a heart part. We refer to said as a heart word because it has one tricky part. It just has one part that doesn't follow what we would expect it to do, right? And so then we can have them rewrite it as a whole word, maybe underline those two parts in the middle, maybe add that heart again to show that this is the part I'm going to pay special attention to. But notice this is very different than just flashing a flashcard and saying said is S-A-I-D, 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 said, 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 said. I'm being very analytical here. I know that S and D say what I would expect it to, and I just have to really pay attention to that middle sound and remember that it's AI and said. I also want to share finger spelling. This is a technique from Orton Gillingham. And basically, it can be something that can really enhance your spelling instruction in your small group phonics instruction. So you would give kids a word like tap. You would say tap. They would say tap. And then they actually tap the sounds with their hands from left to right, because that is the direction that we read in. So they would go t, app, or t, app, if they're left-handed. And then they would sound and write it. So as they write it, they would go t, app, and then they would read what they write, tap, okay? I've made a couple templates here that I will share as PDFs that you could use. Your kids can actually put their hands on the hand to tap the sounds and write the sounds onto the lines. You could use regular lines. You can use the orthographic mapping grid for phoneme grapheme mapping. But this kind of shows you a starting point of how you might enhance this. You can even use regular paper. But this is a nice way to get started with really young kids, especially with CVC words. And you can see there's the tool for a left-handed student. They would write with their left hand and tap with their right. You can see how this translates to all sorts of different activities. So I like to use magnetic letters inside of boxes and really capitalize on the fact that in a lot of our resources that we buy commercially, the consonants are blue and the vowels are red. So you might consider boxing in the grid and doing blue, red, blue when you're doing a CVC word as a scaffold. You might consider putting dots like I did where we have green, yellow, red for beginning, middle, end. There's a lot of things that you can do with this. This shows something I do with my own child at home where when I give him a sight word, he uses tiles or this is just cardstock that's colored to put the sounds and segment them in a chart. So b, ig, and then he adds the letters, B-I-G, b-ig, saying the sounds as he adds them. And then he reads the whole word, big, and we check it against a flashcard. And this flashcard's by Junior Learning. I think they're really great decoding flashcards that they have with underlines under multiple letter graphemes, like vowel teams and things like that, or digraphs. And you can see again the little dots there that are helpful as a scaffold for decoding each word if needed. So as you're doing this, some manipulatives that you might use to support phonemic awareness might include color-coded counters. You might use L-cone in boxes. You might even use a 10 frame if you have them available. You might use some of your math manipulatives that you already have lying around. So counting bears, game markers, snap cubes, foam cubes, math tiles, math links, beads. Those are those Montessori beads. Two-sided counters might be helpful. Play-Doh or Play-Doh lids, Legos, cones and rings, craft pom-poms, track markers or floor mats, plastic canvas mesh, felt squares, or colored index cards. Like, there's no limit to the kinds of manipulatives that you might choose. But again, we want to segment those sounds and then add the letters as much as we can. You might consider keeping sound sacks for small groups. And so this is something you might keep at your small group table just to help cut down on time, passing everything out. And you might consider putting in a checklist to help students kind of go through with a dry erase marker and make sure that they are putting everything back at the end of a session. For the remainder of this, there's sort of a choose your own adventure. I'm not going to explicitly teach everything here, but I am going to let you know that this is available for you to look through. So you'll find a video with the Haggerty hand motions for those of you who are using this curriculum. This is a video that shows you how to do that if you're still working on refinement. And then the rest of these slides really show you that progression from the larger units to the smaller units. So we need to remember that read alouds are important. We can teach about rhyme and alliteration and onset and rhyme and all that fun stuff through read alouds. We can use blocks to address words, and some of our students may still struggle with identifying an individual word or how many words are in a sentence. So here's an activity that might help with that. There are activities in here for rhyme judgment. There's a game called SWAT a word that you can use with a whiteboard or screen. There's a game called sound toss that can be differentiated to look at word level segmentation, alliteration, or syllable segmentation, as well as rhyme production or sound segmentation. We know that clapping syllables is helpful. There's a couple different activities in there for that. A couple activities on rhyme matching and alliteration, on compound and non-compound syllable blending, and onset rhyme division. You'll find a couple activities involving using different colored felt squares or pictures that have been cut in half, although not exactly equally. The onset's a little bit smaller than the rhyme. You'll see how you can use some different manipulatives to also support onset rhyme division if needed. And there are some resources in here on syllable deletion and syllable counting as well. And on onset rhyme syllable division shows you again how that might look. I have some resources in here as well on rhyme production. I go through this quickly because in kindergarten and beyond, although we may still do some of these activities, I want to be very clear that this should not be the bulk of the time that you're spending on phonological awareness or phonemic awareness. We really do need to be focused at the phoneme level as much as possible in kindergarten and beyond. Many of these activities are more well-suited for preschool students, but I do recognize that you may have some students who need this intervention. So I have provided them. But you'll notice on the next slide that there is a K here showing that this is where that transition really should happen. We should start thinking about moving our kids along this continuum in elementary school, beginning with initial sound matching. So we see an activity here where we're helping them to identify the first sounds in our classmates' names. They might do an activity with the names using tongue depressors and pictures where you say a student's name like Matt and they segment the sounds, at, and you ask what's the first sound in Matt and they say what's the last sound in Matt? How many sounds do you hear in Matt? At, they'd say 3, and so forth. There's a lot that we can do with segmenting and blending with our friends' names. I would caution the overuse of name activities, however, because remember that there are a lot of patterns and names that are not being explicitly taught in kindergarten, and it can get really confusing for students who are trying to master the code when we are just randomly exposing them to words that don't follow the rules that they've had exposure to yet. There is an activity here called Walkabout Sound Matching. We have phoneme categorization routines that you might use with your students, initial sound matching, which can be aided by the use of a mirror, final sound matching, blending phonemes. We can do this by pretending to translate what a robot says, for example. And again, I'm not taking the time to go through every activity here because I'm already over my session time limit. But these are materials that you can come back to and read. I'll have notes in the boxes for you underneath, and you can always email me if you have further questions. But when we get into blending phonemes, this is really necessary for phonic decoding. And this is where basic phonemic awareness really starts to become the goal and the focus of our instruction. So you'll see some of the activities we talked about earlier, like say it, move it. We can use puppets for this. We can use say it, move it boards. We can segment phonemes using those little dots or by tapping it. Again, we can use finger tapping here, like I showed you earlier and took the time to walk through. We will use sound boxes. Again, a lot of these things are ideas that I showed you earlier, but you'll see where it fits now in the progression. We have sound boxes that can be kind of novel too. You might think about using ice cube trays and using some sort of object inside of it as a token, or putting a magnetic letter or a letter tile in there to actually manipulate. At times, we may consider using some kinesthetic ways to segment. So I might use mats to hop and do up and then slide, like the cha-cha slide to say hop. I can use, color-coded cones and rings to segment and blend. If I am changing a sound, I might put, if I'm changing the first sound from cat to hat, I can replace the green ring with a blue one to show that I've changed the initial sound. I can do the same thing with small tokens and those rings as well. So there are lots of different ways that I can segment and blend with lots of kinesthetic, multi-sensory movement involved. But again, even in an activity like this, you can see once I've added those little squares to the circles from my mat, I can add a letter tile to add in the orthography and really cement the learning for cat, that it is C-A-T, cat. We can do say it and move it. We can do middle vowel substitution using that method where I move from moose to mouse. We can do initial and final sound substitution where I have a student make new words by changing just one sound. So if I change the b in bat to r, then what word do I have? Rat. I can do sound chaining where students use colored blocks or tokens to mark changes to several words in a row, making one change at a time. So moving from day to date to dot to pot to spot to spit to sit to sits, for example. This is one of my favorites. It's called Tap It, Map It, Zap It. The directions are on this slide, so I highly recommend taking a really deep look at this. This is a great one. But basically, you give them a word like jog, they push up their tokens, og, and they use a magnetic wand to magically blend the sounds and pick up the tokens to say jog. You can see phoneme graphic mapping, or sometimes it's called orthographic mapping here, where I can use a duodot to segment sounds and put green, yellow, red, k, ot, and then I can use a pencil or a marker to go over it and write the orthography and then write the full word to the side. I can do this with simple words like CBC words or words with digraph blends, or I can use it with content area vocabulary that are multisyllabic words like you see on the right. I might at times use this strategically for blending longer words, although I would recommend not overdoing this because you can tell with the word frightening that it can get a little bit confusing. And so if you are in a 3rd, 4th, or 5th grade teacher, I would suggest looking into syllable boxes and checking out my resources in the Stark County literacy resources folders. We also want to move our kids eventually to this advanced phonemic awareness skills like deletion and substitution. So I would say something like say try, and then I would say now say try, but don't say r, and they would say tie. Or say snail, now say snail, but instead of say t, and they would say stale. I can use similar methods that I've done before with middle vowel substitution. Substituting that middle sound is a lot harder than changing the beginning or ending sounds. So moving from gate to goat can be more challenging for our students. Again, we might use a token at first, and then we want to add the orthography either by writing it or using magnetic letters or tiles or some other way to add the letters there. We can also do sound chains at this advanced phonemic awareness level. So I might say potato without the po, and they would say tato. I might say peas without the p, and they would say ease. I might say sheet without the t, and I would say she, right? So you get the idea. Then we have minimal pairs here. It is kind of helpful to look at this. Words that are similar but just differ by one sound. So cut and caught. And then thinking of other words that follow the same pattern that could fit into that. So, jut and jot, for example. We also may teach our students how to reverse sounds. So say cut, now reverse the beginning and ending sounds. The word is tuck. Okay, so just reflect for a moment on how these sample activities might support all students. I recognize that I went really fast through it because, again, I'm already over my time limit, but initially, I had just planned on telling you, hey, check this out later, and I decided on a whim to just give you a very fast whirlwind tour of what was in here. You will need to go back later and check this out and look at things a little bit more deeply. Again, reach out if you have any questions about the activities here, but that gives you a good idea of the skill progression and what a couple activities might look like that fit into that scope and sequence of instruction. So we're going to talk just briefly here at the tail end, if you're still with me, about what to do if there's a phonological deficit. If a screener has identified students who are weak in phonological or phonemic awareness, or if you've observed any of the red flags that we've talked about earlier, we're going to need some information. So giving a diagnostic assessment is a really great way to pinpoint what those interventions for the group of students who need extra support will be. And it's important to note that from second grade and beyond, most screeners don't assess advanced phonemic awareness skills. They typically stop at the first grade level, or they don't go beyond blending and segmenting. So they have kind of a low ceiling. We have to be alert. And so one diagnostic that I recommend that I kind of mentioned earlier is the PAST. It's available for free. I'll link it in the conference page for you to access. This gives us a good idea of whether our students are at that beginning phonological awareness stage where they're still working at the syllable or onset rhyme level, or whether our students are really solidly in the basic phonemic awareness or advanced phonemic awareness stages, and where to begin our instruction. So does phonemic awareness have a role in intervention with older students? If you're a third, fourth, or fifth grade teacher, I would say yes. Phonemic awareness is the underpinning for word recognition. Phonological weaknesses continue to affect and explain reading difficulties at all ages. Many of our students in middle and high school intervention have unremediated deficits in phonological awareness, and they really do benefit from additional practice, though again, that nature of the work really does vary. So again, we want to be aware of the differences between phonemic awareness and phonics as much as possible. We want to segment the sounds with a token and then immediately add those letters if we need to. If we need to use the tokens at all, at a certain point, we might just be able to say the sounds and write the letters, but that's a little bit more of a phonics approach at that point, when we're not using tokens or when we're not using gestures to segment or tap first before we're adding the orthography. There are two ways that we can assist students with multisyllabic words as well, and you see an example here of what I was talking about, the syllable boxes. So I might teach students to spell specific words by showing them the word first, and then teaching them how to match oral syllables to written syllables. So interpret, I have interpret, and the word is interpret. If students are asking me how to spell, I might ask the student to students to spell each syllable correctly. If you're interested in seeing the syllable boxes in a little bit more depth, you can check out another link that I will include to my webinars, where I have a vocabulary webinar at each grade level that utilizes this routine for breaking words into syllables. Orthographic mapping, again, can be really helpful here. So especially with intermediate students and beyond, we might even consider, beyond just breaking them into syllables, breaking words into base words and affixes, or according to the Latin and Greek combining forms, so that we're looking at those meaningful parts and really thinking about what the words mean as well. But again, we can use phoneme, grapheme, mapping kind of strategically. I can use science words and other content area words to do this as well. If I have star, I can break star up into those phonemes by putting the R sounds in their constituent boxes. So you see that. I do recognize that I have a typo here, so I want to bring it to your attention. I usually don't like to do that because I'm a bit of a perfectionist, but on that second word, chirp, the I and the R should be in a box together, and I'm going to have to fix that. Just like UR and AR are in their own boxes together, IR should be too. That's an R-controlled vowel, so it should say CH in one box, IR in the next box, and P in the next box, because it would be chirp. Okay, so you know, we all, like myself in this case, can get in a hurry. Mistakes happen, but we need to try to at least point them out and fix them whenever we can, and really get an eye on our work and make sure that we're clear whenever possible. So again, you know, the next example we see starts, right? That bossy R, that R-controlled vowel is together. The blend is separated. So again, blends are separated, digraphs are in one box, R-controlled vowels are in one box. Anything with a silent E or final E that doesn't serve a purpose, that doesn't have its own sound, and that goes in its own box. I highly recommend a book by Voyager Sopris called Phoneme Grapheme Mapping. It's fantastic. It will explain any pattern that you could possibly be teaching your students and how to actually put it in these boxes correctly if you're just getting started with this. I also have a slide here to help you to support syllabication by thinking about how many vowels are in the word, whether they are together or apart. And those two questions alone really help us to identify how many syllables are in a word, because every syllable has a vowel. We also should really focus on teaching our students how to divide syllables by, you know, marking the vowels and consonants, making a bridge, and dividing the syllables. That explicit instruction is really crucial, especially in third grade, when we are usually prioritizing and teaching those 6 syllable types. This is a routine that might help you too, using word part clues to derive word meaning. So looking at the root word and asking what does it mean, looking at the prefix, asking what it means, looking at the suffix and asking what it means, and then putting those together to ask what is the meaning of the whole word. In this case, we have dis plus agree plus meant, and an approximated definition that says state or quality of not having the same opinion. So it doesn't have to be perfect, but if we can get them pretty close to what the meaning is, then they're going to be pretty successful in that text. And then we also have just a simple routine here of circling prefixes, underlining roots, and boxing suffixes to teach our students, even during a close read, you know, when we're working through a text, it doesn't have to be in isolation, but just looking for opportunities to draw their attention to unknown words and the word parts that are familiar to them. These 2 books are really excellent. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I would recommend 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade teachers looking into especially that using base words and affixes book. You can use double-sided cardstock to segment the morphemes in a word. So I can go from definite to finite to final by working through an activity that looks a lot like this. It usually takes about 5 to 7 minutes. That are really great. It's basically a form of sound chaining, which was something that I referenced when I did my quick whirlwind tour of the phonemic awareness activities that are there for you to choose your own adventure with. So again, this is super fast. I'm about half an hour over what I intended, and it was still too fast. But what I wanted was to give you lots of examples, and there's never enough time, ever, to do the kind of work that is required to really move things forward. So this does require some eyes on the slides after this, if this is something that piques your interest. I am happy to answer any questions that you have. The main thing that I want to leave you with, besides this choose your own adventure slide deck to revisit and assessments to consider to really pair these instructional strategies with, so that we can meet student needs, it's this idea that that language is like an onion, and it can be conceptualized through concentric circles as shown on this slide. So the core is comprised of phonetics, which are speech sounds, and phonology, which are those phonemes. And this undergirds morphology, which are the words, and syntax, which is the phrases and sentences, semantics, which is the literal meaning of phrases and sentences, and pragmatics, which is the meaning in the context of discourse. And I want to stress that I don't expect anyone watching this to be a linguist. I don't expect myself to be a linguist. We don't have to be good teachers. But as demonstrated throughout this presentation, even my whirlwind tour, an expanding and deepening understanding of the way that the English language works, seen through the lens of our grade level content, our standards, our disciplines, this can make a huge difference for our students. Paying attention to that scope and sequence and explicitly teaching and building upon skills can make all the difference. And so I implore you to work together across content areas, across grade levels, across buildings, possibly across districts. I welcome you to join my lead teacher meetings. I tend to talk about a lot of this kind of stuff. And so mainly I just want you to consider new ways to support your students' literacy development and to continue to impart disciplinary knowledge to them, to continue to teach them to access the words on the page. And so again, this was super fast, but if you have any questions, please reach out. My email is amanda.nickerson@apps.spark.org. I want to remind you that knowledge is power. So even though this was an hour and a half instead of an hour, and even though you're still going to have to go back and look at some of those slides to figure out what's usable for you and your students, I hope that it gives you a starting point. I sincerely hope that some of those materials that you can click through and use are helpful to you, that it makes a difference for your students, that they understand things at a deeper level. And I hope that you feel comfortable reaching out if you ever need help and you get stuck and you can't figure out the why or the how. And I also want to leave you with an additional layer of support. So you can use this tiny URL to access a lot of live binders that I've built that contain evidence-based ELA resources. So I appreciate your time. I hope you have a wonderful summer. I hope that, again, this gives you a starting point, but I also hope that you take the time to rest and rejuvenate before going back next fall. Take care. Thank you so much for joining me.